Hello, everybody. Nice full room, that's lovely. Is everyone having a jolly Siggraph? Yeah, good. Yes. It's my first Siggraph, so I'm super happy to be here, and thank you all for giving up your time to join me today. So today, this talk is about workflows for artists. So just before we get started, my name's Liz. I'm an evangelist for EMEA, which is Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So again, it's super exciting to be here in Vancouver at Siggraph. I'm going to be on the booth for the rest of today and tomorrow, but if you want to grab me, this is my social media too. So, stunning visuals, a workflow for artists. What are we going to go over today? That is the question. So, I'm going to go through a complete workflow using a project called Antigraviator, which is by a Belgian studio called Cybernetic Walrus. They're really super great guys, and they gave us access to their assets. So we're going to be using those assets to look at the Unity FBX Exporter. Has anybody used this in the room? One. Good, a few of you, that's great. Whenever I give a talk about artist workflows, I'm always super surprised about how many people don't know about the FBX Exporter, so I'm really pleased that I can share it with you today. Then we're going to be going on to take a look at Siggraph, specifically some of the features in 2018.1. So I'm just going to go straight from the basics. What is Siggraph, how to set it up, and then some of the new features in 2018 too. Has anyone here used Siggraph? Cool. It's going to be lots of learning today. This is good. And then finally, we're just going to look at some post-processing, some anti-aliasing, and just bringing all the visuals together. Has anyone used our post-processing stack version 2? Perfect. OK. Lots of learning. This is good. Maybe I'll learn something too. Who knows? So our FBX Exporter is available from the Asset Store. And it looks a little something like this. And what it does is it allows you to create a live link between Unity and your Autodesk products. So if you're working on a model in Maya or Max, you can be adding and iterating that model, and it will, through the live link, update in Unity straight away, which is super useful. And I'll show you how that works in Editor shortly. Siggraph then is a node-based tool for creating shaders. And I'm going to go through just basic setup, how to get started with it. And also, if there's any programmers in the room who I get asked a lot about creating custom nodes for the graph. I'm not going to go through it today, but there's a great blog post that I can link you to. And also, I'll just show you how you can export the code from Siggraph, and so you can take it off and use that code to do your wizardy programming shadery things. And this is available from Package Manager. So in 2018, we introduced this Package Manager UI. So you can get this from the Windows menu, which I'll show you again in Editor. So Package Manager is just a really great way to organize your Unity-created packages. So you can just download and update what you need for your project and really keep Unity modular and light and just specific to what you're working on. So Siggraph can be found in there. And then finally, we're going to be looking at post-processing. So just as a quick overview before we get in the editor. So the post-processing stack in Unity works on the principle of volumes. So basically, what you'd have in your scene, as you can see from the hierarchy view up on the left, is you'd have a selection of post-processing volumes. And these are effectively colliders with triggers. So if you want to have an area of your environment that you want to be affected by post-processing, like maybe the inside of a cave, you can actually make a custom mesh collider or have a sphere collider. But for today's example, I'm just going to be using standard box colliders. And then how this works is the camera has something called a post-processing layer, which is looking for a trigger, which in our environment today is going to be the main camera. And so what that means is as the main camera moves throughout these post-processing volumes, they'll trigger the post-processing effects associated with that volume. So this will make a little bit more sense when we go in Editor and build it up, which we're going to do together, so that'll be fun. So just as an overview, trying to get my words, FBX Exporter, bringing in our meshes, shader graph to make things look super pretty, and then post-processing to bring it all together and have a nice end to the talk. That's what we're about. Everybody happy? Everybody going to learn something? Woo, yeah. OK, let's switch to the editor. So at the moment, I have a cube. And if I press play, we're going to fly through the environment of our hover racer style racing game. So at the moment, we've got no post-processing, we've got no anti-aliasing, we've got no volume set up. We're using shader graph, but we've got nothing crazy going on at the moment. And we just have this cube, which doesn't make a very exciting racing game. But you know, it's great for white boxing, right? There could be a new genre in this. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just show you how we can use FBX Exporter to just very quickly bring in geometry from Maya, which I have on my machine. But like I said, this is used for Autodesk products, so it works with Max and Maya. So the FBX Exporter is on the Asset Store, which has decided to die. But you saw it on my lovely screenshot. Here we go. So you can download this straight away, totally free, all good stuff. It's this one at the top by Unity. And once imported, if you go to your project settings, you'll see that you have this extra option of FBX Export in there. So if we select this, we can see that we get these options here. So we're having the auto updater set, which I'll show you what that means in a minute when we get into Maya. And what the Unity Asset Store plugin will do is install everything Unity side. So with this, we can now look at what Autodesk applications you have on your machine, and you can choose which one you want to create the live link to. I only have Maya on my machine, so that's why it's the only one in my list. And we can then install the Unity integration. And once we choose where to install that on our machine, that's what's going to install it on the Maya side of things. I already have it installed on my machine, so I'm not going to overwrite it. But you'll see if you've done this correctly when you've done the install, because you'll get this nice little new green Unity menu with import and export. So that's the setup. If once downloaded from the Asset Store, install your Unity integration on your Autodesk product. And then back in the scene view, we can take a look at the object that we want to export. So at the moment, I have this object, which is just called ship white box. What we can do is right-click on that. And you'll see that now we have these extra options. So if we export to FBX, we're just going to export the mesh today. But what you can do is if you have an object that you've animated in Unity or vice versa, you can actually export the models with their animations, and it will take the keyframes into Maya. Similarly, this can be done for cameras, and you can also export your lights out too. And if you export your lights out, once in Maya, it'll swap it for like a like for like. So the directional light in Unity will be replaced by the one in Maya, that kind of thing. And I think, has anybody used Timeline or Cinemachine? So you might have seen this come up as well. So export selected timeline clip. If you're using Timeline for your cinematics, you can actually export the keyframes associated to any timeline clips too. But what we're just going to do today is we're going to convert it to a linked prefab instance. And it's this linked prefab instance that creates the live link between Maya and Unity. So I'm going to select that, and we'll get a few export options which are familiar to what I've just said. So you can have the models and animations, but with the live link, we're just dealing with the mesh. We can change what the FBX is going to be called and the prefab. I'm going to leave that as is. Export formats, and then we're just going to convert that. So now, in our project window, we have a prefab created. Oops, that's the wrong thing. A prefab created. And then we also have an FBX. So the FBX Exporter has created a prefab for use in Unity, and we also have the FBX model, lots of X's, that we can export into Maya. So if I switch to Maya and use the fancy Unity menu to import, to do the live link, you have to use that Unity import menu. The normal import menu won't register the link, just to like reiterate. I have my ship white box here, so I just have my cube and Maya. That's beautiful. So let's pretend that I'm the fastest modeler in the world, and I've made a fancy ship. So what you might have seen here when I unhid this ship is that there's something now in here called this Unity FBX Export set. Now that I've imported in this model and created a live link, whatever is in this export set is going to be what's sent back to Unity. So at the moment, like super simple, high level, I can remove the white box, so I just have the ship. With the FBX export set selected, I can just click export. And if we pop back to Unity, my ship is there, which is lovely. So I just need to pop my textures on now. Where are they? Where are you, textures? And the rest of the talk was Liz trying to find where her materials were. I'm sure I named it ship because I'm really sensible like that. So it's as super simple as that. And this, like I said, this works for your meshes animations. It works for lights and cameras. And you can just keep iterating in Maya, just export it again, and it live links, updates in Unity. So it's just a lot better for your workflow without having to keep importing in and then checking how it looks and then exporting back. It's just, it creates that disparity, which is really useful. So if I play now, it should look a bit more jolly. And yeah, I think I always really like showing the FBX Explorer because it's a really simple, free tool, super, like just great to get started with. But not a lot of artists know it exists. So I am pleased. And that looks tons better already. So the next thing that I'd like to show you today is Siggraph. So Siggraph we can get from the package manager. And sorry, that was very quick. So that was from Windows and Package Manager. And if you don't have it in your project, you can click the Alt tab, scroll down there, and it'll be in there. And you can install it, and you can update it from here too. Has anybody used our new render pipelines, like lightweight render pipeline? Anything like that? Yeah. So if you're familiar with our lightweight render pipelines, if you download this from the package manager, you get Siggraph with that. So that's just something to bear in mind. And actually, Siggraph only works with our new lightweight pipeline. But don't be afraid by hearing these new fancy words. Because actually, if you go to a new project, we have the templates set up already for you to use. So we have templates here where you can get set up with the lightweight pipeline. And actually, what this is, I'll just give an overview, is the built-in render pipeline for Unity. As you know, Unity deploys to so many platforms was kind of like a one-size-fits-all. Am I allowed to say that? But what we've done now is we're actually looking at creating separate pipelines that are more applicable to different devices. So the lightweight pipeline is like the built-in pipeline, but super stripped back. So actually, you're only getting the things that you need for like virtual reality and mobile. Whereas the HD render pipeline, which is this other one, is more geared towards high-end PC. And so there's a lot more there to sort of get higher graphical fidelity out of there, and it's a lot heavier. So yeah, that's just like a little aside note, that if you're wanting to use Siggraph, it's part of the new pipelines, and so you would need to have lightweight or HD installed in your project. Whew, right then. So a lot of what we can see in our scene has actually been created using Siggraph, this node-based system. So if I just take a look at our rocks in the scene, and I edit the shader, it opens Siggraph. And this looks a bit crazy at the moment, but we're going to go back to this later, and it'll all make sense. Because what I think would be cool is if we built a shader from scratch together. So I have got some arrows. There they are. And at the moment, they've got a very absolutely fine yellow shader on there. But I just want to create maybe like a scrolling texture, so it's a bit more interesting. And when the player's going around the track, they know definitely if they're going the wrong way or not. So what I can do is I can right-click, create, and it's under shader, which is there. I know what I'm doing, really. And you can create a PBR shader and an unlit shader, and also a subgraph, which I'm going to show you how to create in a little bit. So we're just going to start with a PBR shader, and let's call this Siggraph arrows. And then we can just double-click to open it. You can have the shader full screen like this, or you can dock it. I like to have it full screen. And so what have we got here? OK, so the first thing that we have is this master node. And if you've used like materials in Unity before, you'll see that these are really familiar. So we've got the albedo, we've got normal, we've got emission. So this is where all of the effects that we're going to make with Siggraph are going to come together. And we're going to see the final result of the shader here. If you have a specific mesh that you want to see this end result on, we have this preview window at the bottom. And you can actually right-click and find a custom mesh. So if we have the ship, I know we're not using the ship, but just for the sake of it. And we can see that in the window there. And then this at the top here on the left is called the blackboard. And that's where if we have any elements of the shader which we want to have in editor to expose in the editor, we can do that here. So they're like exposed variables. So what should we do first? Let's make a new node. So we can right-click and create a node. And there are so many nodes. So let's have a color node. And as I said, there are lots and lots of nodes. So if you like add a node to your scene, oh no, the creative Siggraph is stood in the corner. Matt, why did you come to this talk? You can actually open the documentation to navigate to what that node does and how best to use it and some examples. So that's super useful because there are so many nodes. So what we can do here is I'm just going to create a little red color here, and I'm just going to plug that into the albedo and the emission. We can see that this updates in the preview too. And actually, let's save the asset and apply it to the arrow. So we can do that by just going to the drop-down list, finding Siggraph arrows. And it doesn't look super great at the moment, but we can see that we see it straight away in the scene view. One cool addition in 2018 too is that if you're making lots of graphs and you don't want to have them all in that drop-down, you can actually, underneath the name of your graph, you can actually assign a path. So let's call this Siggraph fun /arrows. And then again, if we save that asset and go back, we can see that this is updated here in the editor. And so now everything is going to be under this Siggraph arrows, Siggraph fun menu. So it just helps to keep it all in order. So let's say that we want to change this color in the editor. You know, artists, we like to make things look pretty and tweak and mess around, right? Mess around wasn't the right way to put it, but what we can actually do is, in the blackboard, we can create a color from here. And let's call this arrow color. And let's set a default of maybe a blue. If I get rid of this color node here, I can drag this arrow color onto the shader graph, and I can plug that in. So we're doing exactly the same as before. We're just plugging it into the albedo and the emission. Can save the asset here. And again, this is updated in the scene view, but also we have the option to pick the color in the editor now. So Blackboard is just there to allow you to have more control if you're wanting to change your shaders in editor. So let's make this a little bit more interesting. So let's add, can't move it around, there we go. Let's add a texture. Oops, let's spell it right as well. So if I had a sample texture 2D to this, I can pick a texture from, here, this arrow. And what I want to do is I want to apply this color that we've just created to this texture. So there's actually a node for this, luckily enough. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply these together. So it's the great thing about shader graph is that you can experiment and have a play around with the effects that you're after, and you can just see them instantly in the graph. And it's just really useful to be able to say, do you know, is this node that I'm using, is it doing what I want it to? I've looked at the documentation, let's double check it. And you can just get the instant feedback from that straight away. Again, we save the asset, we get the instant feedback in the editor. We can also split the channels, which is really useful. For example, if we want to affect the alpha of the shader of the final effect of the shader, I can take like the R channel from the texture, plug that into the alpha. There's some additional options here with the little cog. Oops. So we can set the surface to be transparent, for example. Again, this updates straight away, and we can see that in the asset. Lovely. So now let's sort of do something else a little bit more fancy before I move on. We can create a scrolling texture. I'm just going to show you quickly how. So let's say we have this time node. So you can do effects over time, delta time. You can do it over a sine wave and get some cool like pulsating, glowing effects. And again, what I'm going to do is create a property of a vector 2. Because what I want artists in editor to be able to do is to define on what axes they want this texture to scroll. So I can call these like scrolling axes. And let's put a default of 1 in there. Drag that in. Use that magic multiply node to multiply the effects of the time and the scrolling. And then another magic node. As I said, there's a lot. We can actually plug this into a tiling and offset node. Boop, pop that into the offset. Let's pop this offset into the UV of the sample texture, and we can see that update straight away. And with the tiling too, let's just make it look a bit prettier. If we save the asset and return to the scene, it all updates straight away. And so it's just a really great way to be able to get quick effects, to see what you're creating just iteratively as you go. And it's just really useful to be able to allow that workflow across the team as well by exposing the blackboard. again, adding to this idea of speeding up your workflow, I mentioned subgraphs when I went to create the shader graph earlier. If there's pieces of functionality in your graphs that you think would be useful to reuse, you can actually create a subgraph from the menu, as I showed before, or you can select that functionality. So in this instance, this scrolling functionality, you can right-click, and you can convert to subgraph. Can we see that? Not very well. And it says, what would you like to call this? Let's call this scrolling subgraph. And I'll save it in my assets for now. Sunbergraph, that's fine. Set our defaults again. And then we can reuse this in another asset. So let's take a look at the start line, which is near our ship. There it is. So this, super zoomed in. So at the moment, this start line has this checker shader. If I click on the cog and go to edit it, I can actually right-click, create a node. And for some reason in my version, it's done this on the last couple of days, it should say subgraphs, but it's just magic and blank. But it has all of our subgraphs in here. We define our defaults, and then we can actually take this, and I'm just going to plug this into the offset of the start line shader, save my asset, and when we return to the editor, we can see that the effect of that has taken place on the start line. So you can reuse your functionality that way. Just a little side note, in case none of you have used like shaders in editor before, to see the effect of these, you will have to turn your animated materials on. So if you go to make a scrolling shader and it's not scrolling, that's probably why. So one of the new things in Unity 2018-2 with Shader Graph is the idea of vertex displacement. So I just have a really simple example to show you with the shader of the bushes in the scene. So again, if I edit the shader, one of our very clever evangelists, Andy Touch, has made this crazy algorithm where he's taken the position of the plant in object space. He's actually passed it through a sine wave, done some black magic, and now if we take the output of this and pop it into this lovely position node, ooh. And actually, everything that I'm showing you today, I'm going to give you a link to some example shader libraries at the end. So if you're like, this is really fast, she's going through all these nodes, I don't know what she's doing, there'll be a sample library that you can download and get started with at the end. So don't worry if you're kind of like, what's she on about? So yeah, so in 2018-2, actually this position node is new and can be used for vertex displacement. So if I save the asset here, and we take a little look at, we can see that the bushes are moving ever so slightly. So if I select it and increase the movement speed maybe, there we go. They're rippling now. But this was something that was requested quite often in the early iteration of Shader Graph. So now amazing people like Mr. Matt Dean at the back have implemented that. Am I going to get told off later? So yeah, so that's a nice overview of Shader Graph. Shader Graph you can get from Package Manager. You can start creating super cool graphs straight away. Right-click on any nodes to get documentation. And then the ability to create paths. And Vertex Displacement is super new, just came out in 2018-2. So check it out. So the last part of this presentation then is post-processing. So I'm just going to turn those off for the second. So as I mentioned, post-processing works with this idea of volumes. And on the main camera here, we have this post-processing layer. Everything to do with the post-processing that I show you today is through the rendering. So you add component, and then it's under rendering. Oops, not playables. Rendering. And then we've got post-processing down here at the bottom. So the main camera has something called the post-processing layer. And what this is doing is it's looking for any volumes that have a tag, which are on the layer of post-processing. The anti-aliasing can be set here. So we have it set to temporal for the moment because our camera is moving on the dolly track at the beginning. And you can set all your options for anti-aliasing here. Once the main camera is set up with the layer, you can start creating your volumes. So I'm going to unhide the post-processing volumes here, and you'll see a change happen in the scene view straight away. That's pretty. So the first volume that I have is this global volume. So this is an empty game object that has a post-processing volume component applied to it. And the isGlobal check means that it affects everything in the scene. So it doesn't matter where the camera is. It's not going through these trigger volumes. It affects everything in the scene. And at the moment, we have this global reference set up. But you can create a new profile like this, and it will just give you a completely blank slate for you to be able to add your post-processing effects to it. But at the moment, we're just going to use that global reference. That one. There we go. So in here, we've got some motion blur, which is useful for our lovely moving vehicles. Everybody loves a bit of bloom, and you can actually use these. You can actually add these overrides from the effects. And you can see that in the menu, you add the effect. It says Unity in a drop-down list. This is because you can actually create your own effects too. There's another awesome blog post about that. I've got a link to the Unity blogs at the end because there's a lot of good stuff in there. So this is the global profile that we've got set up. So without anything else in the scene, this would be what was always rendered. But actually, in this game, what we wanted to create was that if you passed under a cave, that the effect would be as if you were in a cold cave. So the lighting would drop, and you'd get the effect that you were going on an underpass. So what we did is we actually created cave volumes. And these are literally just box colliders with a trigger. Oops, let me zoom in. Nothing fancy, nothing to trick you, just a box collider with a trigger, but with a post-processing volume. And these ones aren't global. The post-processing effects will only take place when the camera moves within that collider. And again, we've created a new profile. And this profile has a couple of overrides, the main one being the color grading. So what we're doing in this instance is that when the ship passes under the cave through one of these post-processing volumes, we're just going to saturate the color in there. So let's go back into play mode, and I can show you what I mean by this. Boop. There we go. Ooh, fancy, eh? And you may have a number of volumes set up in your scene. You may want something a little more subtle. So what you can actually do is you can set a weighting. So the weight will sort of set the magnitude of that post-processing volume, the magnitude of that effect. And you can also adjust the blend distance. So if you had a blend distance of 0, it would mean that as the camera passed into that volume, it would switch to the effect straight away. There'd be no transition. So you have control of the effects that you're creating in the editor too. Just another little thing to mention about the post-processing as well is some of the effects have, not all of them, but some of them actually have something called fast mode, which has been introduced. And this is actually optimized for use on like mobile or with virtual reality. So if you're creating something on mobile and you're wanting to use some post-processing effects, just be aware that fast mode like is available to you, which is just good to know. It's just a good little fact to know. So with that in mind, we are at the end of this presentation. So just as a summary, who has heard of FBX Exporter? Yeah, you've all heard of it now. My job here is done. So you can get this from the asset store, totally free, used with your Autodesk products to create a live link between Unity and Max on Maya. Siggraph is available from Package Manager. It only works with our new render pipelines, lightweight HD at the moment. And I'm going to give you a link to the sample library at the end. And then finally, post-processing, which you can get from the Package Manager. You can use volumes to blend between post-processing effects. And then there's also fast mode for your mobile and virtual reality stuff. So the Unity docs have a whole wealth of information on post-processing. Also, check out our blogs. There was a very recent blog on new additions to post-processing. Lots of great information there. And the sample library that I mentioned is actually this GitHub here. So the sample library has this whole array of effects that you can see at the top, plus the new additions of 2018 too as well. So please download that and play. And then finally, we have Unity training workshops. So you can see I have Unity Education on my top. This project and this subset of the workflow is actually part of a larger workshop which we deliver. And if there's a group of you or a studio that like we go to about 15 people per session, a Unity trainer will come to your residence, we won't come to your house, we'll come to your place of work, and we will cut that out, and we can deliver a number of workshops. Or we do custom ones, why not? Maybe there's something in particular you want to know about. So yeah, we do have the trainers and the education team at the booth, 817, if you want to come and chat about that. But if workshops aren't your thing, or maybe there's just the one of you or two of you, we have our blogs, we have a documentation, we have our Learn channel, it's all free. But you can also join in on Unity Virtual Training. So this is usually over a 4-week period, and you tune into a session online. And again, it's with a Unity trainer. And we just go through like the topic of the time. At the moment, I think like optimization is happening, but then the next one starts in October. So yeah, lots of great things to carry on learning. It's all good fun. So yeah, thank you for joining me for this. I know Siggraph, there's loads going on, so I'm really pleased that you joined me, and I hope that you've all learned something. That'd make me happy. So thank you.